2,000 years ago, an empire attempted something no civilization had dared before, to hoard every scrap of human knowledge in one place. Imagine hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, resting in one silent hall. And yet, what survives today is nothing. The greatest memory of human curiosity turned into a void. How can something so vast, so monumental, vanish from the record? That is the mystery of the Library of Alexandria, and its story will change the way you think about knowledge itself. Before we begin, a gentle reminder to like and subscribe. It helps Night Atlas share more stories with the world. Why would a ruler, still carving his name into the wide map of the earth, decide not only to claim lands, but also to gather every thought and story ever written? This is the quiet puzzle at the heart of the Library of Alexandria's beginning. You and I can picture an empire spreading quickly, armies marching day after day, cities taken, kings subdued. In such a rush, the thought of pausing to guard fragile scrolls, thoughts pressed into papyrus, might seem strangely gentle. Yet the dream survives in the legends, that all writings across every border reached by ships or caravans could rest side by side under one roof. It was not an ordinary ambition. It was a hunger that stretched far beyond the reach of swords. Alexander the Great, only in his 20s, had already built a kingdom stretching from Greece to Egypt and beyond. His mind danced with ideas of immortality, not through temples or statues alone, but by making a place where the pulse of human knowledge would never fade. After he crossed into Egypt, stories tell that he stood on the edge of the Nile, the sea wind against his face, and chose to set down a new city. It would be a city he never lived in for long, yet one he hoped would hold his name for all time. Alexandria. He imagined streets that crossed in perfect lines, harbors deep enough for fleets, and walls strong enough to last centuries. It was his way of leaving behind something that would outlast him, not just a military footprint, but an idea. But Alexander's life burned too quickly. At only 32, fever struck him. His empire, still fresh and fragile, fell into the hands of his generals. No library had yet been built. No scrolls had been gathered in grand halls. Only sketches in the mind, visions of a city that might reach toward eternity. When he breathed his last, that floating dream seemed lost, like smoke carried away by wind. The suddenness of his death left more questions than answers. Could any man step in and finish what he began? From this silence, Ptolemy, one of his closest companions, rose to claim Egypt. Where Alexander had carried a vision without a foundation, Ptolemy began to bind that vision into stone. He needed more than soldiers to prove his worth. He needed symbols, monuments that linked him to glory. Anchoring Alexander's dream into the soil of Egypt, he chose to plant not just a city of trade, but a beacon for thought itself. This choice changed everything. Imagine standing at the harbor of Alexandria in those first years. Ships arrived heavy with goods, grain, papyrus, glass, spices. Sailors shouted in many tongues, their voices rising in a mosaic of language: Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, Hebrew. Markets bloomed with cloth and pottery, while priests from old temples walked beside Greek philosophers and scribes, hurried with ink-stained fingers. At night, lamps from the shore flickered on the dark waters, guiding vessels in like fireflies to a flame. This was not a quiet frontier town. It was already humming, alive with mixture, and at its center, Ptolemy began the work of weaving together Alexander's dream. In this sight of a city blooming from nothing, we can feel the call to adventure. Humanity itself seemed invited, for every culture had its wisdom, medicine from Egypt, myths from Mesopotamia, philosophy from Athens, charts from mariners of the Mediterranean. No one people owned the answers, but here they could be gathered. Here the many voices of the world might be copied onto papyrus and placed side by side. That was a new kind of ambition, far greater than conquering rivers or mountains. It was the attempt to conquer, forgetting itself, to demand that wisdom not fade into the cracks of time. Think for a moment about the scale of this ambition. Gathering every text in the known world meant more than simply copying a few books. It was the effort of capturing the fragile memory of humanity itself, written not on stone, but on papyrus, light and frail. Imagine scrolls carried across deserts or fished out from the hands of merchants. Think of languages meeting, having to be translated, rewritten, cataloged, each scroll a fragile artifact, yet treated as part of a vast treasure meant to cover centuries. To suggest such a plan in an age of clay and ink was almost absurd in its reach, and yet Ptolemy dared it. So Alexandria became more than just stone streets and painted walls. In spirit, it became a summons. It whispered across harbors and villages, "Bring us your stories, your discoveries, your words." There was an urgency behind this call, not just the pride of a king, but something more human. A longing to hold on to memory, and in doing so, perhaps, to rise above the limits of life itself. Alexandria's role was not simply to host people, but to gather their wisdom, and in return, reflect it back to them as a light that shone farther than any empire could. Picture the scrolls as seeds, carried by countless hands, floating across the sea like pollen carried by the breeze. Each arrival made the library dream more alive, more real. Not only would people gather, but ideas would begin to meet each other, intertwine, and create something stronger. The city itself became a crossroad of thought, where myths, sciences, and writings brushed past one another as casually as sailors at the docks. The ambition carried risk, for gathering all wisdom in one place also meant carrying its weight. But that risk seemed a part of the call, a part of what made this more than a project of rulers. It was as if the whole of humanity had been asked, "Shall we keep our stories safe?" And the world, slowly, began to answer with scroll after scroll placed within Alexandria's growing walls. In this way, Alexandria grew larger than the men who dreamed of her, greater even than Alexander's fleeting plan, greater than Ptolemy's desire for legacy. She became a symbol of collective memory, the chosen place for knowledge itself to come together, to be given a body, a sanctuary against loss. And so, from the dream of one conqueror and the will of his successor, a city rose not just with markets, not just with streets, but with the stirrings of the greatest library the world has ever imagined. We can almost sense the scrolls waiting, can almost hear the soft murmur of voices speaking in every language beneath the endless desert sky. What began as vision now begins to take shape, no longer rumor or hope, but stone halls slowly filling with papyrus. The journey from dream to reality had begun, and Alexandria was ready to embrace it. How do you take a young port, still smelling of salt and spice and tar, and turn it into the brightest home for thought on earth? It feels almost impossible when you picture the ships creaking into the harbor, ropes pulled tight, and anchors splashing into the water. At first, Alexandria might have looked no different from other seaports of the age. Sailors unloaded cargo, merchants haggled for price, and officials measured grain or pressed wax seals onto documents. Yet behind those ordinary rhythms, something else stirred. The city was being shaped into more than a crossroads of trade. It was being prepared as a sanctuary for wisdom, a place where learning breathed like prayer. That spirit gathered around the Mauseion, a name that meant the seat of the Muses. You can imagine it not as a single grand chamber, but as a wide complex with shaded courtyards where people walked slowly, their minds caught in argument or thought. Columns supported high roofs, walls stood in quiet rows, and gardens gave scholars space to wander in silence. The Mauseion was not simply a storage hall. It was thought of as something sacred, like a temple raised not to a god, but to inspiration itself. Within its boundaries lived teachers, researchers, physicians, and readers, each with their daily rhythms, writing, teaching, debating, preserving. Beside this vision of learning stood the stories of a great library, said to share its heartbeat with the Mauseion, but not always described as the same place. This is where the mystery begins. Some records speak of one colossal building, a chamber filled with thousands upon thousands of papyrus scrolls, each placed in order like careful breaths in a chest. Others whisper of two libraries, the royal one, tied to the Mauseion and its palace walls, and a second standing near the Serapeum, a temple built much later. It is a puzzle that historians still argue about. Were there two centers of knowledge or one? Was the Serapeum a kind of extension, a branch to cradle overflow when the first halls grew too tight? No single answer survives. The haze of time leaves us with fragments, each pointing in a slightly different direction. Picture the Serapeum. If it did hold part of the treasure, high steps climbing above the city, a wide temple courtyard echoing with footsteps, shrines and statues lining the way, their figures gazing down as if to guard what was kept inside. To walk into such a place would not have felt like entering a warehouse, but like stepping under the weight of something far larger than yourself. And that feeling, whether in the Mauseion or Serapeum, set the tone. Knowledge was not seen as ordinary, it was treated as holy, as something to be offered respect, as though the very act of reading or writing carried a spiritual dimension. Now, imagine being a scholar invited into this world. The city called out to thinkers from Greece, Egypt, Babylonia, India, and far beyond. Here you might wake in a small chamber attached to the Mauseion. The morning sun filtered through a thin woven curtain. In your hands, perhaps a stylus or quill. After a meal, you would make your way into shaded halls where scrolls waited stacked on shelves, their titles written carefully on little wooden tags. You might join a circle of colleagues arguing over a translation from Egyptian into Greek, debating how best to capture the shape of a word, or whether it should be expressed at all. Daily life within the library was not quiet in the sense of a modern reading room. It pulsed with the sounds of discussion, of lines being repeated aloud as scribes copied them, of teachers lecturing while students tugged at arguments, eager to test them. There may have been rituals we no longer know, small offerings to the Muses before a lecture, conversations sung like chants, or meals shared communally with the purpose of mixing thought along with bread. What we can sense most of all is that this was not a place for idle storage. A scroll left unread was a scroll unalive. Each one carried breath only when scholars argued over it, quoted it, translated it or reshaped it for new listeners. The library became alive in this way, not with bodies, but with voices, memory passed from one tongue to another. A text copied from Hebrew into Greek carried with it not just words, but layers of culture, belief, and history. In such work, mistakes became discoveries, and discoveries spurred debate. A physician comparing Egyptian surgery to Greek medical ideas might find connections no one had seen before. A geographer reading a Babylonian chart might open new maps of the known world. All of this came not from scrolls alone, but from the balance of scroll and scholar, page and person. And in this environment, Alexandria turned into more than architecture. We might think of the library as a building with scrolls packed into wooden niches. But in truth, it functioned like an organism, a living body fed by constant arrival of texts and constant discussion to keep them moving. Without speech, without debate, even the safest scroll would mean little. With those human rhythms, even a simple fragment could grow into new thought. It is this atmosphere that made Alexandria such a magnet. People did not come only to deposit their knowledge and leave. They came to be part of something fluid and communal, a weaving of words and thought that felt both endless and fragile. And it is here, perhaps, that we discover what made the library legendary. It was not just the number of scrolls or the walls that held them. It was the sense that knowledge could breathe in unison, that the thoughts of thousands of years could be brought close enough to speak to each other. If you stand still in this picture for a moment, you can almost hear that hum, not the clatter of a marketplace, but the steadier sound of ideas in motion. Pages touched by hands, translators repeating lines softly, a teacher pointing to the sky as they argue about the stars. In this rhythm, the library was not a silent museum of texts, but a living space where memory, study, and curiosity became one. In the end, Alexandria's becoming as a city of knowledge was less about bricks or columns and more about atmosphere. You could walk into it from the harbor and feel that here more than goods and ships were being traded. Here minds were crossing paths. The library did not freeze thought in place. It pushed it forward, reshaped, retold, revived. Like a great heart, it pumped ideas through the veins of the ancient world. This living system demanded something new, though. With such a growing flood of scrolls, with voices speaking across languages and generations, chaos always lurked nearby. How would a scholar find the right work among hundreds of thousands? How could memory be built strong enough not to collapse beneath its own weight? The answer would come in the form of order itself, a different kind of invention, born not of war or empire, but of cataloging the endless sea of words. How could a library in the corner of an empire swell so quickly when in those times books meant scrolls, and every scroll was the result of hours of careful hands pressing ink onto fragile papyrus? To picture it, you need to return to that city by the sea, where ships leaned into the harbor with their sails heavy and their decks stacked with goods. Alexandria, still new yet already proud, needed trade to keep its streets alive. But within those harbors was hidden another kind of traffic, not grain or glass, but pages of memory. The secret lay in a rule whispered to captains as their ropes were tied. Surrender your scrolls at the dock. Every ship that entered with any written work, be it medicine from the East, poetry from Greece, charts from Phoenicia, was asked to hand them over. Imagine how strange that must have felt. You arrive with spices from a distant island or linen woven from inland fields, And suddenly you are told the scrolls you carried for your own use, the texts you hoped to sell, or even personal records you kept close, must be given. They were taken to be copied, ink for ink, page for page. The promise, perhaps kindly offered, was that you would receive them back. But when the copies returned, something had changed. The originals never found their way again to the ship. The copies you received instead were called from the transcribers, while Alexandria tucked away your originals deep inside its growing library. Each docked ship became not only a vessel of trade, but an unwilling messenger of knowledge, its writings pulled into the city's tide. The harbor itself became a kind of river, carrying texts. You could close your eyes and almost hear the flood, the splash of waves against hulls, sailors shouting as crates were lowered to shore, and within that bustle, scribes hunched over desks by lamplight, rushing to copy the newest arrivals. It gave the sense that each ship brought not only goods, but also voices, words of thinkers long dead, stories from regions many Alexandrians would never see, songs from tongues the scribes barely understood. The trail of words did not stop at the shore, but flowed into the city like water through a net, caught carefully, written down, filed, placed into storage racks, their wooden tags tied, their ink pressed just dry. And it was not only the policy of the harbor that fed this current. Some were sent outward to hunt for words actively. They were known as book hunters, seekers of manuscripts across the Mediterranean's edge. You might imagine one of them stepping softly into the Aegean islands, asking if any scribe in the village had kept a version of Homer different from the ones already known, or wandering into the markets of Asia Minor searching for treatises on astronomy or fragments from older kings. These hunters did not carry weapons, but instead empty wax tablets and satchels ready to copy. They moved through cities as quietly as shadows, carrying back not goods, but thoughts, entire lifetimes bound into scrolls. There is an audacity in such acts, to take from every visitor the very heart of their knowledge, to send men across seas to gather from other shelves, speaks of a hunger larger than trade or politics. It was as though Alexandria cared less about who owned the ideas and more about keeping them within its reach. But such boldness never comes without questions. Merchants surely grumbled when original works never returned. A poet who carried his own compositions might have discovered that Alexandria now claimed a copy of thoughts meant only for a patron. Kings from other lands might have frowned at the thought that their written history had been carried off into the vaults of a foreign city. To take is one thing, to preserve is another. The line between them blurred here. Think now of how quickly these practices swelled the library. Each day, more vessels arrived. Each day, more scrolls placed into shelves. The harbor's endless stream meant that the library grew not in decades, but in years, swelling by hundreds, then thousands upon thousands of works. The Mausion, and perhaps the Serapeum, if it indeed held a part of the collection, must have felt the pressure. Scroll racks filling beyond capacity. Rooms that once echoed with only quiet debate, now heavy with papyrus bundles. The sense must have been both exhilarating and overwhelming. On one hand, the world's knowledge pouring in, a dream being realized. On the other, the disorder of too much, the fear that everything valuable might be lost again by the sheer weight of confusion. And with that image, you can begin to see not just how bold the library's methods were, but also how fragile the balance. Every scroll doubled the responsibility. Every copy pushed the challenge higher. It was like water, filling a basin faster than it could be drained. If they could not find a way to flow through it, to organize it, all the energy would become chaos. But for now, in this time of gathering, it was enough to feel the power of the tides. Picture standing by the port at dusk, the horizon pink from the setting sun. Ships anchored close, their sails pulled down, ropes creaking against the tide. Dock workers carry crates into warehouses. Inside, hidden from the markets, scribes wait with papyrus fresh and ink taken from soot and gum. A merchant hands over a scroll, perhaps a family's genealogy written in careful lines, or a fragment of philosophy treasured through generations. The scribe lowers his eyes to the page, and the copying begins. Line after line, the words are reborn, their rhythm slipping onto clean sheets. Hours pass, a lamp burns low. When the work is done, the copy goes back to the ship with little fanfare. The original works, silent but enduring, remain behind. By morning, the merchant sails away with something that appears familiar, not knowing that the root of the text has been claimed by the city. The audacity of such a practice cannot be ignored, yet so too can we respect its vision. Without these choices, however forceful, the library could never have grown so swiftly. The law of the harbor and the wandering of the hunters turned Alexandria into more than a city. They turned it into a reservoir where the world's thought flowed together. Not every civilization welcomed the practice, yet the result was clear. The library became a mirror of human history, reflecting back voices gathered from afar. Every vessel brought words. Every shore fed the tide. We return then to the question of speed. How did the Library of Alexandria grow? It grew because it transformed commerce itself into memory. It stretched the hand of empire not only east and west, but into the shelves of every distant town. Where others saw trade, Alexandria saw circulation, a chance to fold the words of the world into one place. That is how the library filled so quickly, how its silence grew heavy with the voices of centuries. But with such abundance came risk. The larger the collection, the easier it was for minds to lose their way inside it. Capturing all words was one thing, making them usable was another. And so, in time, the library would face its next challenge: how to bring order to chaos, how to keep the sea of scrolls from drowning those it was meant to guide. What happens when a library becomes so vast that it no longer feels like a gift, but instead like a labyrinth? You can imagine standing inside one of those great halls in Alexandria, the shelves rising high around you, scrolls tucked into niches and leaned against one another in bundles. The air carries the faint smell of papyrus and soot ink, and yet, despite the richness within reach, a visitor feels lost. There might be medical texts from Egypt pressed against fragments of poetry from Athens, or star charts hidden behind genealogies carried in from distant lands. To find a single work among these mountains would take hours, even days. So while the library grew in size and wonder, it also began to breed confusion, a strange kind of disorder born not from neglect, but from too much care. It is in that world of both treasure and chaos that we hear of a man called Callimachus of Cyrene. Imagine him walking along the shelves with a small stylus in hand, making notes on wax tablets as he passed. He could hear scholars muttering in frustration when they could not find the texts they sought. He could see scribes worn down from trying to remember where a certain copy might have been placed the season before. Callimachus felt the weight of the problem, The library had become so enormous that memory itself needed a guide. So he set to work, not writing poems or recording myths, but crafting order out of the flood. The result of his effort was something extraordinary, though at first it may not have looked extraordinary at all. He created what we now call the Pinnaces, a catalog so long it stretched across 120 volumes. Each volume served as a kind of map, a way to walk through the collection without becoming lost. To picture it, imagine a series of tablets or rolls, each one carefully written with titles, authors, descriptions, and notes on literary style. He grouped works by subject, poetry, medicine, law, astronomy, and then within each group arranged them further, connected by threads of name or origin. It was not enough to store what humanity knew. Someone had to show others how to find it again. We might smile at the thought today because such systems feel ordinary now. Every library in our world expects an index, and every archive keeps some way of navigating its shelves. But in Alexandria, this was new and daring. Callimachus was not simply making a list for his own use, but building a structure of memory that could outlive him. Without it, knowledge might overwhelm its guardians. With it, the flood might be directed into useful channels. Picture the feeling of a scholar entering this world before the catalog existed. Perhaps she has traveled from Athens carrying memories of a teacher's lectures. She arrives in Alexandria hoping to consult treatises on medicine or philosophy hinted at in her homeland. She steps into the hall, sees the endless racks of scrolls, and quickly realizes she does not know where to begin. Days pass. She searches, questions scribes, and at times gives up, exhausted by the sheer scale. Without guidance, the treasure becomes almost useless, like a sea without a boat. Now picture that same scholar entering again after Callimachus finished his work. She is handed a volume of the catalog, its neat script pointing the way like a lantern in a dark room. If she seeks astronomy, she can turn to the section on natural sciences. If she remembers only a fragment of a name, the catalog may guide her to the rest. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, she feels supported, able to stand on the shoulders of those who cared enough to place order into chaos. In that moment, the library becomes usable again. It is easy to forget how radical this idea was. To create a catalog meant to say that knowledge required not only gathering and protecting, but also navigating. Memory on its own was not enough. Tools had to be made to preserve memory's shape. This was not just about keeping track of scrolls. It was about acknowledging that human minds needed help to hold such abundance. Callimachus, in this sense, was not just a librarian. He was an engineer of thought, building pathways that others could walk for centuries. Imagine the sight of scholars opening the Pinnaces together. One whispers the author's name, another traces it with a finger through the sections, another rushes off to fetch the indicated scroll. Their work speeds up. Debates sharpen, translations move forward, discoveries emerge. The library, no longer threatened by its own enormity, begins to breathe more smoothly. The catalog is never as famous as the scrolls themselves, but within its ordered lines lies the hidden skeleton that allows the living organism to stand. There is also something humble in this achievement. Alexandria dreamed first of conquering the limits of memory by gathering every text in one place. But as soon as abundance arrived, the dream threatened to collapse. It was a reminder that ambition alone cannot sustain what is vast. structure must support it, guiding the human mind gently through the maze. The Pinnakeys, quiet and unadorned, stepped in as that structure. It prevented the flood from sweeping the library away into confusion. Think now of how that idea ripples forward into the present. When we stand in a modern library with shelves that ring through several floors, we take for granted catalog numbers, subject headings, and search stations. But at its core, that impulse to divide, list, and guide begins in places like Alexandria under Callimachus's hand. He did not invent the desire to organize knowledge, but he gave it a scale never seen before, and his work planted seeds that shaped the way humans manage memory across all subsequent centuries. So the library was not only a house of content, it became a birthplace of systems as well. Scrolls could be gathered by the thousands, yet without a way of finding them, their voices would slip into silence. Organized, they remained alive, ready to meet new readers, to spark new debates, to offer their lessons once again. Order gave the library its second life, rescuing it both from confusion and from the danger of becoming an inert monument. And with that quiet triumph, the collection stood ready for something more. Now, there was not only abundance, but also clarity. There was not only gathering, but also pathways carved through the gathering. The scrolls could meet readers. Readers could meet one another. And in that meeting came sparks of new genius, the kind of thought that might change how humanity saw itself. With peace restored to the library's halls, the stage was finally set for minds of rare brilliance to walk into Alexandria and attempt the impossible. Who were the ones who stepped into this vast garden of scrolls and gave it life? A city can gather books, yes, but without minds willing to question, the halls stay cold. Alexandria's story brightens when we picture the men who sat in those quiet courtyards, scratching ideas into papyrus, testing thought against thought. They were not kings, and most of them did not command armies. Yet in their own way, their reach was farther than conquest. Through geometry, astronomy, mechanics, and invention, they answered the library's call not just to preserve memory, but to create new knowledge. We can picture them now, walking under stone arches, whispering with colleagues in sunlit gardens, each person holding a seed of discovery that still bears fruit in our world. Think first of Euclid. His name alone has outlasted centuries, and his work in geometry has remained a backbone of education long after those early days in Egypt. Picture him at a simple desk in Alexandria, working with chalk and straight edge. To him, shapes were not just drawings, but truths waiting to be described clearly. A point, a line, a plane, small ideas nearly invisible on their own, yet powerful enough to describe land, architecture, and the very patterns of stars. The way he arranged his thoughts in ordered steps, one proof leading to the next, laid out a model for reason that continues to guide learning today. He was not gathering old wisdom alone. He was giving it discipline, shaping it into a system that could carry memory beyond culture or language. His book came from those halls, and in doing so, it gave the library more than scrolls. It gave it a foundation of logic itself. Now picture another figure, standing with eyes lifted toward the midday sun, a stick in the soil, casting a clean shadow. This was Eratosthenes, who asked a question so bold that many must have thought it impossible. How large is the earth itself? He could not board a ship and sail around it. He could not climb into the air and look down. Yet he noticed a simple clue. In the city of Syene, south of Alexandria, the sun at midday on the summer solstice lit the bottom of a well, showing no shadow. But in Alexandria, on the very same day and hour, a shadow stood clear beside a tall column. By measuring the angle of that shadow and knowing the distance between the two cities, Eratosthenes found a way to calculate the whole circumference of the planet. His tools were no more than a stick for shadow and careful pacing across roads, yet the result was astonishingly close to what we still measure now with satellites. Imagine the wonder this must have stirred. A reminder that truth can be hidden in plain sight, waiting for a calm and curious eye. Around those same gardens walked minds with different questions. One of them, Heron, let curiosity about force and movement guide him. We hear of his drawings for a device powered by steam, called the aeolipile. Imagine it, a small sphere mounted to spin, steam rushing out through little nozzles, pushing it around with a hiss. A toy, perhaps. In its simplicity, but hidden inside it something immense. The idea that heat and water could be made to power machines lay silent for nearly 2,000 years before it was used again. It is a strange thought that in Alexandria's halls, the seed of the industrial age swirled quietly in miniature, seen by a few, then set aside as though the world was not yet ready. We might ask ourselves how history would look if such devices had spread sooner. Would factories have risen early along the Nile, steaming gears turning beside rows of papyrus reeds? Or was it enough for one mind simply to imagine what was possible? The scholars who came here were not all mathematicians and inventors. There were astronomers who mapped the skies, physicians who compared herbs and cures from many lands, poets who copied and recopied ancient verses from Homer and added their commentaries, grammarians who sought to fix the dialects of Greek into correct forms. Each one added not only knowledge but also methods, shaping fields of study into disciplines that could be shared and passed on. If one walked through the Mausion, one would hear many different sounds. The measured tone of teaching, the lively debate over a passage, the quiet scratching of quills, the strike of a stylus on wax. Together, they created something more than the sum of separate ideas. They created continuity, so that when the original thinkers were gone, their methods of reasoning, their standards of proof, their experiments and observations would still carry forward, capable of shaping minds across centuries. Consider how bold their questions were, to ask for the size of the earth, to propose that steam can spin a wheel, to lay the rules of geometry with number. Room for doubt. Such things must have seemed as wild as myths. Many around them may have thought these ideas foolish or unnecessary. Yet these scholars had the time and the space to ask anyway. In their hands, the library became more than a collection of texts. It was a workshop for thought, a place where ideas tested their own strength. What Alexandrian thinkers truly demonstrated was the courage to ask questions no one had charted before, and to build answers patiently out of shadows, lines, and flame. Picture walking those shaded gardens at dusk, the air still warm, scrolls stacked along wooden benches under a colonnade. A teacher sits with students at his side. One listens to a proof in geometry, sketching lines with a stick on the sand-packed floor. Another waits eagerly to test a small device, a vessel steaming over embers, its hum a thin whisper in the quiet. Another marks the angle of stars, careful in noting how their rise and fall changes with the seasons. These were scenes repeated softly day after day, not wars, not parades, not sudden drama, but rhythms of thought so steady they outlasted empires. And so, When we think of the Library of Alexandria, we should remember more than walls of scrolls. We should remember men like Euclid, Eratosthenes, Heron, and countless others whose names do not echo as loudly, but whose work stitched knowledge together. They were living proof that preservation is not just about collecting what is already written. It is about nurturing what has not yet been said. Without them, Alexandria would have been only a warehouse. With them, it became something alive, creative, and forward-reaching. In facts sketched on sand, in shadows cast at noon, in sputtering jets of steam, we glimpse the legacy of these golden minds, their courage to question, their discipline to reason, their willingness to attempt the impossible. All of it ripples beyond their lifetimes into ours. Even today, in classrooms or laboratories far from the Nile, their methods whisper beneath the surface, guiding the way we think. But as their achievements grew, so too did the shadows at the edges of Alexandria. For every era of light carries its own fragility, and while the library glowed with brilliance, events outside its walls moved quietly toward trouble. Word spread not only of knowledge, but of power, and storms of fire and conquest began to stir beyond the city's calm gardens, waiting for a chance to break in. Picture the city again, crowded and alive, but this time its walls are not holding only merchants and scholars. Roman soldiers march outside, their armor glinting under the Egyptian sun. It is the year of Caesar's struggle for survival, and Alexandria stands as both prize and battleground. You can imagine the young general stepping through the chaos, his forces pressed against the city, his enemies closing in. The harbor fills with ships ready for war, their sails flapping, their torches burning. In moments of desperation, choices become sharp. To stop his enemies from gaining control, Caesar orders the ships in the harbor set alight. What began as a campaign of politics and survival now spreads into flames, with consequences far greater than he could have expected. The fire starts along the docks, where wooden warehouses line the shore. Grain, rope, timber, and sails quickly ignite. Boats meant for trading, their hulls stacked with goods, become tinder. The heat rises, smoke climbs into the sky. Soldiers shout over the crackle of fire, and sails collapse into embers. Sparks fly, pushed by the wind of the sea. The burning does not stay confined to ships alone, but leaps across the harbor into storage halls, where cargo is stored. The line between military strategy and uncontrolled blaze blurs, and soon rumors begin to grow that within those stores were not only goods, but also scrolls, shipments of papyrus, stored until they were ready to be carried inland to the libraries. This moment becomes one of history's first shadows over the Library of Alexandria. Was it here, on the docks, that tens of thousands of texts were lost? Some ancient writers speak of this destruction as a fact. They write of scrolls turning black, libraries consumed in the smoke, knowledge vanishing in a single night. To them it was catastrophe, an act unintended perhaps, but one that removed centuries of thought. Yet others in those same times described the fire more softly. They claimed that perhaps only the warehouses were touched, that what burned were not the library's collections, but the cargo waiting at the shores. To those authors, the Mausion still stood strong, untouched within the heart of Alexandria, its scrolls safe inside their niches. Which story holds more truth remains uncertain, even now. What we can imagine is the contrast. On one side, the flames roar and the harbor bends to chaos. In that sound, you can feel loss. Ships consumed, wooden beams snapping, cries from sailors as their livelihoods vanish. But beyond the docks, in shaded courts where scribes sit close to their scrolls, calm might have remained. Scholars leaning over text, quills scratching, whispers of language drifting across rooms. For them, the fire may have been distant thunder. To walk through those halls in that moment might have given little sign that outside the city was burning. The sharp lines between destruction and preservation leave us unsure which vision is closer to truth. Even the ancient testimonies cannot agree. Some believed the library's greatest collection perished in those days under Caesar. Others insisted the heart of the institution survived, bruised but unbroken, ready to continue its work. The debate has never faded. Centuries later, historians read those words and find no clear answer. Did the fire undo the dream in a rush of smoke? Or was the damage partial, just one of many blows across the library's long existence? What lies before us is not certainty, but mystery, a reminder of how fragile memory is when events pass beyond living witnesses. There is a sadness in this uncertainty. We find ourselves picturing crates of scrolls tied with twine, resting in neat rows in a warehouse by the sea. Flames touch the beams above. Collapse comes suddenly. Parchment curls and letters vanish with the smoke. It is an image easy to believe because fire feels final, its erasure immediate. Yet it is also possible that those scrolls were only a fraction, a margin of what the scholars had already locked safely in their halls. If so, then the vision of complete ruin in Caesar's time is less a memory and more a myth. The truth hides behind the haze of competing voices. Still, this story remains powerful for a reason. It ties human error, human choice, to the loss of knowledge. A single command to burn ships meant to protect one general's survival could lead to the silencing of hundreds of voices from the past. Even if only a portion of the scrolls were lost, the symbol became heavy. It gave later generations a moment to point to, a story they could tell about how fragile wisdom is, how easily erased. In this way, whether the flames destroyed thousands or only a lesser number, the image of fire at the base of the library's story was born. For us, it becomes a picture of contrasts. Imagine the harbor at night, flames glowing, black smoke rolling toward the stars. Now picture the library itself, still in shadow, its shelves heavy, its scrolls intact. Scholars unaware of what fate was being assigned to them in distant retellings. One scene stands in the open air of the docks, violent and uncontrolled. The other stands in the silence of learning, calm and uninterrupted. To hold both images together reveals the tension at the heart of this question. Fire touches one part of Alexandria. Was that flame enough to reach so far inward, to climb into the library's pulse? We cannot say. You might wonder why certainty never reached us. The reason hides in how fragile records are across the centuries. Accounts survive, yes, but each reflects its writer's perspective, and even in their day, voices conflicted. Without clear answers, time itself knit the story into something larger than fact. The image of fire-destroying wisdom became heavy with meaning, greater, perhaps, than the details ever were. And so Caesar's fire stands not as a single conclusion, but as the first of many shadows. Perhaps it was the original blow, perhaps no more than a rumor tied to the chaos of war. Either way, the tale of fire in the harbor left a scar, raising doubts about the library's safety and reminding us that no collection, however grand, can be secure against the accidents of men. This was not the end of Alexandria's library, but it left behind the sense that endings could come quickly, without warning, without fairness. From that time forward, the aura of risk surrounded the library. Even if the flames did not reach its shelves, the idea that it could vanish in smoke hovered in memory, and soon the city would face not only the choices of generals, but the wider hand of time, sea, storm, riot, neglect. If the library was not destroyed outright in Caesar's day, what else lay ahead to weaken its walls and wear away its treasures, one fragile scroll at a time? Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the story guide you. From here, imagine the scenes in your mind as the story unfolds. Imagine the calm blue of the Mediterranean on a bright day in the year 365. Fishermen pull nets from the sea. Families walk along the edges of Alexandria's wide harbor, and merchants carry their goods through the markets. Then, without warning, the sea begins to suddenly draw back. Boats list in confusion. The tide stretches further and further away from the shore, and before there is time to understand it, the water returns with a force no man can hold. A wall of sea rises and collapses onto the great port. In an instant, a city that has stood for centuries is struck as if the ocean itself had chosen to reclaim it. The accounts tell us of buildings swallowed, of ships thrown inland, streets flooded with salt water, and thousands of lives lost in only a few moments. You can picture the crash of timbers, the sounds of shouting, the heavy silence when the waves recede, and nothing is as it had been. For a city built on trade, the sea was a promise, but on that day it turned into a destroyer, and in that collapse may have gone parts of the great library. Papyrus, smooth and thin, could survive only in sheltered rooms held dry. Brought into contact with salt water, the fibers warp, the ink smears, and entire volumes return to pulp. Scrolls drowned not in flame, but in brine, their letters erased not by men, but by tide. This one disaster lingers in memory, because no fire or sword was needed. The harbor, the ships, the very walls of Alexandria bent outward and crumbled under the weight of returning waves. It is difficult to know how many scrolls were housed near the port at that moment. If the library held works in warehouses or secondary storage, they may well have joined the timbers and pottery that shattered in the flood. The waves would not have spared wisdom simply because it was written. A city built as the crown of knowledge sat helpless, its precious words floating, sinking, or dissolving into the sea mud. But the tsunami was not the only wound. Across the centuries, Alexandria lived through marches, riots, and sudden bursts of violence that marked its streets. Think of times when rulers changed quickly, when faiths rose and clashed, when crowds filled the alleys in anger. In such moments, libraries and temples became targets, not because of specific hatred of books alone, but because they stood as symbols of power. A torch thrown into a storehouse during an uprising, a mob breaking statues in a temple, or soldiers ransacking streets during a siege could scatter collections and silence careful work in a heartbeat. Scrolls that had rested for centuries could be seized, broken, taken as kindling, or carried away, not always out of intent to destroy, but out of disregard, the kind that comes when ordinary survival commands more attention than words on papyrus. As we move slowly across the centuries, we notice a pattern. Each event alone may not have ended the library, yet together they wore it down. One storm saturates part of the collection. One riot scatters copies into hands that cannot protect them. One change in leadership withdraws support, leaving scholars without safety and emptying halls that once echoed with study. Decay is not always loud. Sometimes it creeps quietly, until one day what was vast has become almost nothing. The dream of a single safe house of knowledge was always fragile. Every scroll had a body, and every body was breakable. Papyrus could be eaten by insects, dried into dust, or destroyed with a drop of water. Ink could fade if not preserved. Without care, even the greatest store withers in silence. Alexandria, for all its ambition, had to face this truth. Time itself was as much an enemy as any invading general. One century might lose a wing of the library to fire, another to flood, another to political change, to look only for a single moment of destruction. One tragic night misses the way loss often works. What perishes is not always sudden. Sometimes it is the work of centuries pressing down. Think of the scholars who still gathered in later centuries. They may have worked in smaller rooms with fewer scrolls than their teachers had known. They might have lamented quietly that certain texts could no longer be found. Perhaps one recalled a copy of a lost play seen years before in another chamber, now missing, its place empty on the shelf. Another may have searched the catalog only to discover that its entry led to a scroll that no longer existed. Tiny moments of disappointment that together formed the steady thinning of memory. When we step back, we see that Alexandria's loss was not a single blow, but a long, narrowing path. The grand halls imagined by Ptolemy's founders probably never stood untouched throughout all those chaotic centuries. A flood may have swept part of them. A fight between factions may have looted another section. Imperial neglect may have allowed shelves to sag, papyrus to crack, ink to vanish. Each step left the library weaker, until little remained but the shadow of its memory. The calm reflection to bring from this is that fire is simple to imagine. We see flames and smoke and know the outcome. But time's destruction is less dramatic. It comes in water, in insects, in the rough hands of armies cleaning out rooms during riots. It comes in neglect, the simple failure to protect what is fragile. And in Alexandria's story, all of these work together. A tsunami, a wave of unrest, a shift in rulers, a lost era of support. Each was a tide pulling the dream apart. So when we ask how the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, the answer may not be one name or one night. It may be decades stretched into centuries, in which waves, mobs, rulers, and quiet neglect acted as many small blades cutting into its body. We are left not with certainty, but with a shape of loss that feels much more human. Not sudden erasure, but slow fading, like stars paling when dawn rises. It is in this understanding that we realize why so many myths were created after. People long for a single story, a villain to blame, a moment that explains everything at once. And so, later ages began to invent one final tale, a dramatic ending, carried not by sea or riot, but by command. That myth still carries weight, and it waits at the edge of Alexandria's story, ready to take its place in memory. We turn now to that last telling, where history gives way to legend. Did the Library of Alexandria finally fall in a single act of burning, commanded by a new ruler? This is the story often told, repeated in many later centuries. People say it happened during the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 CE, when Caliph Umar was asked what to do with the vast collection of books said to remain in the city. As the tale goes, he gave a direct order. If the writings agreed with the sacred book of Islam, they were not needed. If they disagreed, they were false, and so not worth keeping. And with that, the scrolls and manuscripts were used as fuel in public baths, burned for months until nothing remained. It is a dramatic image, easy to pass on and simple to remember. You can picture scrolls stacked high, carted through the streets of Alexandria, brought into shaded bathhouses where fires were kept for warm water. Flames catch, papyrus curls, the ink fades into smoke. Day after day, the words of centuries drifting up as ash while people carry buckets of hot water for baths, unaware of what is being consumed. This story now lingers as one of the clearest endings, as if knowledge itself was deliberately fed into fire under the order of a ruler. But when we look closely, questions arise. The writers closest in time to the conquest of Alexandria, those who lived during or just after 642 CE, are silent about such an act. Muslim historians describing the capture of the city do speak of battles, of treaties signed, of changes in rule. Yet they do not mention libraries being destroyed or scrolls burned. It is only long later, centuries after the conquest, that the story begins to surface. It appears in writings from the medieval period, written far away in time and place, and told almost as legend rather than record. This silence in the early sources leaves us in doubt. Why then did the story grow so popular? Perhaps it was the desire to explain absence. By the time the myth became common, the great library was already gone. Centuries of time, waves of wars, riots, neglect, fire, and flood had done their work. Yet an ending was still desired, a final, clear note to close the song. People longed for a single cause, an act large enough to explain why such a treasure no longer stood. The Arab conquest provided a moment, and the myth grew around it. We notice as well that the tale is not about careful history, but about symbol. It points to a ruler who, with a single order, casts aside all human thought in favor of one book. Whether or not this occurred is almost secondary to the force of the story itself. It has been used by later writers as a way of making sense of cultural change, of framing the conquest of Egypt as not only military but intellectual. Yet in truth, the silence of the earlier centuries matters. If such a monumental act had truly taken place, it seems strange that no one near the event recorded it. Picture for a moment what it would mean if the tale were true. Think of workers carrying armfuls of papyrus each morning to keep fires alive. Think of scholars standing, perhaps helpless, watching works they had studied vanish in smoke. Yet also think of the utter practicality of it. Bathhouses needed fuel, and papyrus burned well. But does practicality explain absence of clear memory from the people who lived it? It feels uncertain, like a story shaped after the fact, filling a gap with drama rather than detail. Modern historians approach this tale with caution. They remind us that memory is not always faithful. Centuries leave room for invention, and invention often gives neatness to what is subtle and unclear. In this case, the myth of Caliph Umar's order feels like a simplification, a way to draw together the fading of knowledge into one single stroke. It turns what was most likely a long, uneven process of decline into a single tragic scene. And such a scene is easier to carry forward, easier to retell, than the more difficult truth of centuries of slow loss. There is also the question of why medieval writers repeated the story in the way they did. We might imagine scribes in different lands, working with what little information reached them, adding detail to make their accounts feel whole. In doing so, they gave voice to the imagination of how knowledge might vanish, not necessarily the record of how it truly did. And with each retelling, the flames grew hotter, the number of scrolls larger, and the myth stronger. We often think of myth as something separate from truth, but here the myth has become almost as powerful as any fact. Ask people today who destroyed the Library of Alexandria, and many will point to this tale of the Caliph and the burning baths. The story has taken root not because it is proven, but because it is vivid. It carries the weight of irony, that the greatest. Library ended in the most careless way. That irony settles into memory more deeply than the slow and uncertain details of floods, riots, or neglect. And yet, reflect on what that tells us about ourselves. We prefer endings we can picture, especially tragic ones that symbolize human folly. The idea of long centuries of slow decay, of scrolls rotting or being misplaced, feels unsatisfying. It does not give us a clear lesson or image to carry forward, but the story of an order to burn books, of fire-consuming libraries in the service of power, feels like a morality tale. It shows how fragile wisdom can be when set against authority. So, the last myth of Alexandria reminds us less about what happened to the books themselves and more about how we think about loss. Myths grow when history leaves silence. They fill the emptiness with stories that carry meaning even if they do not carry fact. In that sense, the myth of Caliph Umar's command has become part of the library's identity, just as much as the truths of cataloging, collecting, and debating within its walls. The irony is that the story of its destruction has become almost as legendary as the library's greatness. The fire of Alexandria may never have burned in 642 CE, but the image of flames licking through scrolls still haunts us. It shows us how absence demands shape and how myths provide it, even at the cost of fact. And so we are left with a question. If the myths grew louder than the facts, then what truly was lost when Alexandria's library faded away? Was it all of ancient wisdom gone forever, or did much survive elsewhere? That question leads us onward, asking not only how the library fell, but what it actually took with it when it disappeared. When people speak of the Library of Alexandria, they often imagine its fall as the moment when the ancient world's memory was erased forever. The myth is painted in simple strokes, that inside those shelves were every play written by Greek poets, every observation from Babylonian stargazers, every piece of medicine, history, and philosophy humanity had ever known. And when the flames, the waters, the riots, or the neglect took hold, it all turned to nothing, leaving humanity stranded in darkness for 1,000 years. It is a haunting picture because it suggests that one fire or one wave ended an entire world of wisdom. But is that truly what happened? Take a slow breath and picture the library not as a single vessel holding everything, but as one of many vessels on a wide sea. Its loss mattered, yes, but the sea itself was larger than Alexandria. Scrolls had lives outside its walls, and words moved in ways even destruction could not always touch. To think otherwise is to forget how ideas travel. Caravans carried writing across deserts. Monks copied manuscripts in dimly lit corners of temples. Scholars taught students face to face, passing knowledge even without paper. The myth of absolute loss folds all these currents into silence. but the evidence suggests some voices continued downstream. Let's imagine a few of the roads those voices took. Works of Greek philosophy did not vanish when the library shelves thinned. Copies made their way into the hands of students and teachers scattered across the Mediterranean. Many of Aristotle's writings, for example, were read and preserved in schools outside Alexandria, then translated into new languages in later centuries. Roman libraries housed technical texts, histories, and poems that survived long enough to be recopied in monasteries of medieval Europe. Even when one chain broke, another carried forward the memory. The same happened with scientific traditions. Though Alexandria might have preserved great collections of medical texts, others lived elsewhere. The writings of Galen, a Roman physician, were copied widely and became part of medical teaching throughout the Middle Ages. Texts on astronomy, mathematics, and geography passed into Arabic as they were translated by scholars after the rise of the Islamic world. When we speak of lost knowledge, it is easy to forget how often it reappeared under different roofs, spoken in different tongues, protected by other hands. Alexandria may have been the brightest lantern, but it was not the only light. Think also of the rhythms of preservation across time. In the monasteries of Ireland, Italy, and the Byzantine East, monks copied Latin and Greek works with steady patience. Within Islamic centers of learning, from Baghdad to Cordoba, scholars translated Greek science and philosophy into Arabic, debated it, and passed it onward. These fragments were not perfect mirrors of what once sat in Alexandria's halls, but they kept memories from turning to ashes altogether. Later, during Europe's Renaissance, many of those Arabic and Greek texts circled back, translated once again, fueling new centuries of discovery. If Alexandria fell, memory limped, but did not die. This is not to say nothing was lost. Many plays of the tragedians existed once in abundance, but survive now only in scraps of papyrus uncovered from deserts. Histories mentioned in ancient catalogs leave behind only their titles, their voices, forever silent. Whole schools of thought may have vanished with the collapse of shelves no longer standing. The loss is real, but it was not a clean slate, not the turning of all knowledge into smoke. It was a thinning, a narrowing of the stream, not its total evaporation. The myth jars us because it suggests a perfect undoing, yet history suggests otherwise, that memory, though fragile, splinters and scatters, and in scattering, survives. Picture this: a scholar in Spain during the Middle Ages unfolding a manuscript in Arabic that carries words from Aristotle, words that centuries earlier passed through hands in Alexandria. Across the sea, a monk in Florence copies the same ideas in Latin to share with his brothers. Later, those lines inspire teachers of mathematics or philosophy in modern universities. Each link is unlikely, each depends on chance, yet it proves that destruction is never complete. Fragments continue, even if they arrive tattered, even if their roots are forgotten. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson of Alexandria's loss. We imagine all wisdom bound in a single room so that we can grieve it as one. But memory resists such neatness. It spreads, it adapts. It requires care in every age, but it also hides resilience. Even as wars swept the Mediterranean, as emperors rose and fell, as the Nile surged into harbors, words traveled quietly in bags, in letters, in whispers from teacher to student. Alexandria was not the sole guardian of them all, yet it symbolized the longing to hold them safe, and when it weakened, we chose to imagine the worst possible outcome to honor its absence. We may take comfort in this, that although the Library of Alexandria fell, we are not cut off entirely from antiquity. We still read Homer's epics. We still study Euclid's geometry. We still walk inside the thought world laid down by philosophers whose works wound their way through centuries of careful copying. Medicine, astronomy, theology, history, all retained portions carried through Byzantium, through Islam, through Europe's scriptoria, and into the present. What truly disappeared was not everything, but more than enough to make us feel the silence. Sit for a moment with that silence. An empty shelf where once a scroll stood. A name in a catalog with no surviving text to accompany it. These are the shadows left by loss. Yet beside them are the voices that remain. The dialogue between Socrates and his students. The diagrams of circles drawn by astronomers. The hymns carried from temples to chapels. Survival happened alongside absence. Both truths live together. So did humanity lose all its wisdom at Alexandria? Number. We lost songs, stories, manuals, sciences we may never recover. But we also carried fragments into new eras, and those fragments seeded the worlds that followed. Without them, there would be no Renaissance, no foundation for much of modern science, no guideposts of philosophy. The loss was broad and heavy, yet not absolute. And in a way, this mixed truth has made the story even more powerful. Because when we realize memory lived on in pieces, we begin to see why the myth of the library's complete destruction endured. It mattered less whether every scroll burned, and more that people imagined a single place where wisdom had almost been kept whole, and then was broken. The legend grew not only to mourn what was gone, but to remind us of how precious and fragile knowledge is. It is this tension between survival and absence that gives the Library of Alexandria its lasting hold on our imagination. And that survival, scattered though it may be, is the reason the legend matters more than the facts. The myth is a mirror reflecting our fear of forgetting and our hope that memory, even in fragments, can light the way forward. If the Library of Alexandria never ended in one great fire, why do we still remember it as if it had? What keeps this place that might never have held every scroll and might never have been burned in one night at the center of our imagination? The answer lies not in the walls or the papyrus, but in what the library has come to mean beyond its history. It has become a symbol that we all share, a story that touches not only the past, but also the present, reminding us how fragile memory can be and how much it depends on being cared for. Imagine the story of Alexandria as a mirror. On one side is the historical city with its docks, temples, catalogs, and scholars. On the other side is the reflection we carry in our minds, a place where all wisdom stood side by side under a single roof and then was swallowed whole by destruction. The second image is perhaps more powerful than the first. Even if historians argue over details, the loss of knowledge has turned into something we feel in our bones. When we talk of something precious being forgotten or destroyed, we still speak of it as another Library of Alexandria. It has become a shorthand for that deep fear of forgetting what matters. The myths, in this way, simplify the tragedy. They give us a single moment we can imagine, rather than decades of erosion and countless small losses. It is easier to picture flames than to picture a shelf sagging slowly into dust. A story about a fire gives the loss a villain and a sudden end, but the myth does more than make it clear. It keeps the lesson alive. Every time the story is told, whether or not the detail is exact, it repeats the warning that knowledge is fragile. Like papyrus near water or ink left too long in the sun, memory can vanish if no one protects it. So when we think about Alexandria today, we are not really thinking only of Egypt 2,000 years ago. We are thinking about our own time. Picture this. In the modern city of Alexandria stands the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. It is a library built not to replace the old one, since that can never be done, but to honor its memory. Its round form reflects the image of a rising sun, a reminder that knowledge itself is a source of light. Within its walls are millions of modern books, rooms for research, and archives dedicated to preserving what we know now. Visitors walk in through glass doors, feeling a continuation of that ancient call to keep memory alive. In this way, the myth of the past inspired a very real creation for the present. And it is not only Egypt. All over the world, different forms of libraries and archives hold the echo of Alexandria, even if silently. Think of vast institutions like the British Library or digital collections that store data for anyone with a computer. Think also of quiet rooms in small towns where shelves hold family histories and local papers. At every scale, there is the same impulse that began at Alexandria, the desire to gather words and guard them from loss. Even if the dream was never fully possible centuries ago, the idea continues to guide us in countless ways. Our present adds to this story something the ancients could not even imagine: digital records. Unlike papyrus, fragile and destroyed by flood or flame, digital memory allows millions of texts, voices, and images to be stored in invisible form. They live in servers and are backed up in clouds, spread across the globe in silent humming machines. But here we face again the symbol of Alexandria. Because even though digital storage seems strong, it is still fragile in its own way. Systems fail, clouds collapse, data corrupts, and without care, what seems invincible could vanish in a blink. The library's larger lesson rises again. We should never feel that knowledge is too secure to guard. Think about how strange it is. 2,000 years after papyrus curled in the desert air, we now store memories in code and light. And still, we borrow the story of Alexandria to remind ourselves of knowledge's fragility. Whenever we wonder about what could be lost if servers failed, if archives burned, or if a flood struck, we picture the image of the ancient library, gone in flame or abandonment. The myth remains alive, acting both as warning and encouragement. It also speaks to our longing. The idea of all knowledge in one place is still tempting. We see it in the way digital companies boast of organizing the world's information, or archives attempt to collect the whole of the internet. There is always the whisper of Alexandria, pushing us to think that gathering everything will keep it safe. Yet the truth is that no place, whether ancient hall or digital server farm, can be completely safe on its own. The real protection comes from spreading memory wide, letting it exist in many forms, in many places, on many tongues. Alexandria's story reminds us of this too. So the library lingers not because of how it ended, but because of what it represents. It has become an eternal metaphor, a lesson carved into our imagination. It tells us something simple, but repeated in countless forms. Wisdom is fragile. Stories are fragile. Records are fragile. They require not only creation, but constant protection, and not only by rulers or scholars, but by all of us. With every act of copying, of preserving, of teaching, of translating, the flame is passed on. That is the opposite of fire. It keeps the light alive rather than consumes it. We might pause and imagine someone placing a scroll onto a shelf in the library 2,000 years ago. Now compare that to someone saving a file into digital storage today. The impulse is the same. To hold a thought long after the thinker's gone, to carry memory into a future that cannot yet be seen. That is the human answer to fragility. And that is why the Library of Alexandria is not really gone. It lives as memory and myth because it reflects that shared human need. In the end, the library is not just ruins, nor only a myth. It is a call, carried across centuries, asking us to care for human memory. When we speak its name, we are not only remembering a place on the Nile, we are promising ourselves that memory matters, that it is worth protecting. The lesson is silent but strong, waiting in every archive, every bookshelf, every file. Each act of keeping knowledge alive answers the call that Alexandria first spoke. And in this quiet understanding, we learn what the story teaches, that knowledge is always fragile, yet always worth the struggle. What remains is whether we are willing to tend it, now and in the years yet to come. The Library of Alexandria endures not as stone or scroll, but as the gentle reminder that knowledge is fragile and must be cared for. Picture each library you know today, shelves of books or quiet digital files, as carrying the same torch once lit by Alexandria's dream. Every act of saving, every scan, every careful copy, every book borrowed and returned is part of that larger journey. We can slow down and see ourselves as guardians, each of us holding a small piece of memory safe. In doing so, we quietly continue the same heroic task begun so long ago.